History often remembers monarchs for their splendor. Coronations, victorious wars, magnificent palaces, but beneath every glittering crown lies a dark shadow. And these shadows, more often than not, determine the end of the person who holds the throne. Such is the story of the life of King Henry VIII of England, a tragic journey that began as one of Europe's most powerful monarchs, and over time transformed from glory to decay, from the body of a handsome prince to a colossal, stinking corpse. And his end was so horrifying that even 5 centuries later, it still sends shivers down the spine when told. When Henry Tudor was born on June 28, 1491, at Greenwich Palace, no one knew that he would become one of the most feared rulers in European history. The Tudor dynasty was still fragile, its roots weak. His father, Henry VII, had won the throne after a bloody civil war, the War of the Roses, but mistrust still reigned among the people and the nobility. For this reason, young Henry was seen not just as a prince, but as the future of the dynasty. His youth was shaped by the ideal of a perfect knight. With his strong physique, tall stature, auburn gold hair, and deep blue eyes, Henry was noted by his contemporaries as one of the most handsome princes in Europe. Not only his looks, but also his intelligence was remarkable. He learned Latin, French, and Italian, was interested in music, composed songs, and even gained a reputation as a master tennis player and hunter in his time. People saw in him the perfect king of the future. Strong, handsome, cultured, and blessed by God. When he ascended to the throne at the age of 17 in 1509, a great sense of hope swept through the people of England. The public believed that after his father, who was known for his cruelty, a young and energetic king would usher in a new era. And indeed, in his early years, Henry dazzled with both his generosity and his grandeur. European courts were talking about his magnificent tournaments and lavish feasts. England was now in the hands of a powerful king. However, it was Henry's ambition that shaped his destiny. His greatest desire was to produce a male heir to secure the future of the Tudor dynasty. But his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, could only give him a daughter, Mary. His male children were either stillborn or died after a few days. For Henry, this was unacceptable. Was it God's curse, or was the marriage improper? These questions gnawing at his mind drove Henry down an obsessive path. This obsession changed not only his private life but the fate of an entire country. When the papacy refused to annul his marriage, Henry founded his own church. The split of England from the Catholic Church was one of the most shocking moves of the Reformation. And this decision upset not only religious but also political balances. Henry had declared himself the absolute representative of God in England. But the price was high. Rebellions broke out, monasteries were closed, and monks were hanged. In the eyes of the people, the king, who was supposed to be God's representative, had actually turned into a tyrant who shed blood for his own ambitions. He divorced or executed his wives one by one. He had 6 marriages but only got the male heir he wanted from Jane Seymour with the birth of Edward. He too was a frail and sickly child. Even at the peak of his power, Henry could not be satisfied. Everything was for more control, more grandeur, more obedience. This hunger began to rot his body and soul at the same time. The year 1536 was a dark turning point not only for England but also for Henry's destiny. That year, at a magnificent tournament near Greenwich, the king, wanting to show his power to the public, was on his horse as usual. Inside his splendid armor, he still looked like one of the most majestic rulers of Europe. But fate, in a single move, shattered this glory. His fall from the horse, which seemed like a simple accident from the outside, was the beginning of an irreversible destruction for Henry. The blow he took to his leg during the fall turned into a deep and infected wound. This wound never healed. Over time, it filled with pus, bled constantly, and began to emit an unbearable stench. The court physicians tried to treat it with all sorts of ointments and primitive methods. Leeches, cauterizations, herbal mixtures, but nothing helped. The wound was the harbinger of a decay in the king's body, as if he was beginning to rot alive. This single wound changed the course of Henry's life. The king, who was once an agile, athletic, and strong warrior, gradually transformed into a bulky body. As his body became heavier, his mobility decreased, and his inactivity led to more weight gain. He gradually became a prisoner of his own body. While his waist size was around 35 inches in his youth, it grew to 54 inches in his final years. When his weight exceeded 400 pounds, he was no longer a human being but a ruler carried by a massive body. The court had to adapt to this change. Special mechanisms were set up to move him. Doors were widened, corridors were opened. A primitive elevator system was designed to allow him to move between rooms. The king was now less a ruler than a massive burden that had to be carried. There was no trace of the young and glorious Henry who chased prey and swung a sword in tournaments. But the decline was not just in his body. There was an equal ruin in his soul. A king writhing in pain and unable to move began to become more and more paranoid. The sense of trust disappeared. He accused even his closest advisors and friends of treason. The men who once stood proudly by his side were now handed over to the executioner. A deathly silence reigned in the palace. No one dared to look the king in the eye for long, because the slightest glance, the possibility of being misunderstood, could cost them their life. Servants hesitated to enter his room, and doctors sweated profusely when they approached him to treat him. As his wound oozed pus, those who entered his room often felt faint from the unbearable smell. Henry's anger, along with the decay in his body, also spiraled out of control. To suppress his pain, he took refuge in food. He consumed every kind of food placed before him, especially meats, to excess. The court kitchens could not keep up with his appetite, but every bite made his body a little heavier, accelerating his decay instead of healing his wounds. At this point, Henry was no longer just a king but a legend that aroused a mixture of fear and curiosity within the palace. The whispers of the servants included the phrase, "There is an unbearable smell in His Majesty's room." According to rumors, some even fainted from nausea when they got close to his room. As the king's body rotted, his soul was poisoned at the same rate. Henry, once a charismatic, courageous, and inspiring leader, had now become a suspicious, cruel, and merciless tyrant. Every new execution had become a tool to satisfy his paranoia. He showed not the slightest hesitation in signing death warrants, and he did not shy away from having the heads of even his closest friends cut off. Henry VIII had turned into a shadow that poisoned all of England, just like the smell of his own wound. His presence was now a source of terror, not security. Even the footsteps echoing in the palace corridors were perceived as a sign of an approaching executioner. By 1547, Henry's torment had reached an unbearable point. The servants wandering in the dim corridors of the palace had to take a deep breath before approaching the king's room and then cover their faces with handkerchiefs, because the smell emanating from his body was not just nauseating, but a dizzying, suffocating poison. That smell was proof that one of Europe's most powerful rulers was now rotting from the inside out. Years of overeating, alcohol, inactivity, and endless wounds had turned Henry's body into a tomb. Chronic kidney failure, liver problems, and advanced diabetes were slowly rendering his body dysfunctional. The most terrifying were the wounds on his legs, the festering, constantly oozing, and infected legs that had never healed since that fateful horse accident in 1536. Now his flesh was falling off. Every dressing change became torture for the nurses. When the bandages were opened, everyone in the room felt a stone in their throat, Their eyes welled up, and some collapsed. The king was no longer the magnificent warrior who rode horses on battlefields and mowed down enemies with massive swords. He was stuck in his enormous bed with gold-embroidered curtains at Whitehall Palace. His body had become so heavy that it was impossible for him to move. Special pulley systems and elevator-like mechanisms were set up around his bed, but even they were of no use in his final days. His room had become a tomb. Incense was constantly burned at his bedside, and the strongest herbs such as sage, lavender, and juniper were used to suppress the smell. The smoke rising from the silver censers slowly drifted towards the ceiling, surrounding the room like a sharp mist. But nothing could hide Henry's decay. The smell always seeped through the herbs and incense, even clinging to the palace walls. The physicians were desperate. Europe's most talented doctors, healers, and surgeons were summoned repeatedly. But none of them could stop this decay that reigned in the king's body. More pus oozed out every day, and a new piece of flesh came off with every dressing change. Henry's legs were like two huge open wounds, and as he writhed in pain, he did not hesitate to unleash his anger on those around him. Even breathing was now a struggle. His chest rattled with a heavy sound, and his heart beat irregularly. On his sleepless nights, he had nightmares. Sometimes he would see his dead wives, and sometimes his executed friends covered in blood before him. According to whispers in the palace, Henry had begun to be crushed by the weight of his own sins in the days leading up to his death. But no one dared to voice these things to his face, because the king's anger was terrifying even on his deathbed. On the morning of January 20th, 1547, dark clouds hung over the palace. For days, Henry had been going between fainting and wakefulness, walking a fine line between madness and clarity. That morning, his consciousness slowly began to fade. The heavy silence that filled the room was broken only by his rattling breaths. A few loyal servants at his bedside prayed silently, their eyes fixed on him. In his final moments, no one dared to remind him of his sins. Neither priests nor close friends could urge him to confess to prepare his soul, because Henry had instilled fear in everyone around him throughout his life. The shadow of his anger was present even on his deathbed, but death knows no anger. And finally, in the afternoon, Henry's breathing became heavy. His chest rattled once more, and then silence fell. Henry VIII, at the age of 55, at the center of the glory and power he had amassed for years, but in the grip of the diseases that were eating away at his body, breathed his last. The golden walls of the palace, the magnificent rooms filled with silver candelabras, had now become the tomb of a living corpse. Europe's most feared ruler had finally been defeated by his own body. But the truly horrifying thing was not Henry's death, but the days after it. His body was placed in a coffin to be taken to St. George's Chapel in Windsor. However, during the journey, fluids began to leak from the coffin. According to legend, the decaying bodily fluids from the coffin dripped onto the ground, and the dogs there began to lick the fluid. It was said among the people, "Even dogs do not reject the corpse of a king who has suffered God's wrath." This event became a symbol of Henry's rotting body. Court historians were horrified even when they described this scene, because only a few decades earlier, Henry, who had been one of the most handsome and powerful princes in Europe, was now just a rotting, stinking pile of flesh being fed to dogs. Power, glory, splendor, all were nothing next to a rotting body. The story of Henry VIII is one of history's most striking warnings. It reveals how power, when combined with ambition, leads to decay. Henry, who was the king of hope in his youth, eventually became the tyrant of fear, the symbol of decay. His end reminds us of a bitter truth. No matter how powerful you are, no matter how magnificent the palaces you live in, everyone shares the same fate in the face of death. Henry's rotting body is one of the most terrifying symbols of this. Today, when we remember Henry VIII, we remember not only his 6 wives, his religious reforms, or his political games, but also the story of his rotting body, his terrible smells, and the coffin licked by dogs. Because history records not only glory, but also decay.